Phoenix and Sultai are kind of your go-tos. Now it's mono-red Phoenix. But we're going to start with Standard. This is the Sultai versus Esper matchup.
And this is one that's kind of defined the weekend in a lot of ways, where Sultai midrange was the deck that won last weekend, so a lot of people are viewing it as the deck to beat this weekend, and Esper Control is what people have chosen to try and just outgrind it in the resource game.
Right, we see Thought Erasure, turn 2 from Kane Rianhard. Let's take a first look at the Sultai deck. So Bosley's hand has a copy of Vivian Reed, a Merfolk Branchwalker, a Karn, an Incubation Druid, and a land.
This is a lot of cards that we kind of refer to in shorthand as +1s, because all of these cards are something that is just going to generate another resource immediately.
Right.
You know, this Branchwalker is the, quote, worst card, and it's going to draw a land. Vivian's going to find another creature, Karn's going to roll up and give you another card for your trouble, and they all have to be answered fairly immediately.
Right, because Esper controls a powerful deck, though it has a bit of a gap when it comes to Planeswalkers. It has these Vraska's Contempts, and that's about it once they're on the battlefield.
Right, so Esper Control is trying to just use counter spells to stop them from ever hitting the table, but once they actually get onto the battlefield, they're a little bit of a problem.
So Thought Erasure was pretty much forced to take the Karn there as Bosley was threatening to make a Karn on turn 3. As a result, Bosley's follow-up was that Branchwalker. He put a Plaguecrafter into the graveyard and then made the third land.
Exactly, and this is just one of the situations where it doesn't necessarily feel very good to be doing these plays, but when you're the Esper Control deck, you're kind of just threading a needle and answering the specific answers that are going to give you the most trouble, and eventually just gas back up with all of your draw twos, your Teferis, and the like.
And here's where I love the pressure you see that Bosley is putting on this game. So Rianhard had to shock to go down to 18 already that turn. That's just to hold up Absorb, but I don't think Bosley is going to commit that Vivian Reed into 3 open mana, especially not when his opponent took 2.
Yeah, exactly. There's a real cost to just jamming this Watery Grave here. So why would you do that unless you have some other threat?
Exactly. This is actually Biogenic Ooze, the play here, and that's still going to get the Absorb. It's a one-of in the deck for Ian today.
And the reason that you would jam that there is because it gives Kane the opportunity to make a mistake, because Kane, that's a card that can be mopped up by Kaya's Wrath. So when you see Esper Control, that's the card on your mind. But if Kane commits that Kaya's Wrath, it taps him out, and then Bosley could just play the Vivian Reed into no available mana the following turn.
And a good draw here, or play rather, from Kane, a second Thought Erasure. We see Vivian Reed and Find Finality. This is actually really nice because before we had the spot where Vivian was forcing Kane to leave up 3 mana basically for the rest of the game.
Exactly. So now if you can just take something like this Vivian Reed or the Find Finality,
Ooh.
all of these are draw twos, and you're just trading 1 for 1 instead of letting Bosley get as many 2 for 1s.
Moment of craving. So I was actually going to ask what you thought of this. This is a bold play from Kane. Rather than taking the Vivian, he Thought Erasures away the Find Finality, Moment of Cravings Llanowar Elf, and hopes that there's no land, and it converts. But that was a big risk.
That's a Llanowar Elf, not a Landowar Elf.
Now, I do wonder whether or not Kane had a Vraska's Contempt in hand, right? That's a much safer play if he has an untapped answer for the Vivian.
Exactly. There are a lot of ways that ultimately he could just answer the Vivian there. It's also possible Kane had planned to, say, jam Teferi on 5 and then tuck the Vivian to deal with it again later.
Sure. A swing in and puts Rianhard down to 10. End step, cast down for the Branchwalker. And I do like how Kane can hold up a counterspell and then chip down this board on end step. This is what he wants to be doing.
Exactly. This is a spot where it is on Ian to close the game before it gets to a spot where Kane can just answer something. End of your turn, cast a draw 2. Answer something. End of your turn, bring back my draw 2 to just cast it again, etc.
Right, those are the corner turning plays from Esper, is either these end step draw 2s or perhaps something like 6th land Teferi, untap 2, leave up Absorb.
Look at this.
Okay, so Ian, deciding that things are getting pretty bad after that cast down, just jams Vivian Reed into 5 open mana, and what a reward. It resolves and finds Hydroid Krasis.
Oh my gosh. Ooh, here's the Vraska's Contempt that you were talking about.
Yeah, Kane had it, but I think Ian is still okay with this trade of resources. He has a Krasis, Memorial to Folly. He took a big risk there on that tap out, and it paid off.
Oh, absolutely. And, I guess this is just a situation where, worst case scenario, I guess you're just going to have to settle for a 6 mana 4/4 flying trample, draw 2, gain 2. By the way, the card draw's uncounterable.
Yeah, that's right. That's the cast trigger. Kane down to 12. He's been able to stay above water through this life gain off cards like Absorb and Vraska's Contempt, but that Hydroid Krasis is just so punishing here.
And this is why the Sultai deck tends to be so good, is all of its threats are things that kind of demand immediate answers, or else they'll take over and just generate more advantage, either in the form of being an excellent clock, or just threatening, say, a Planeswalker ultimate.
From Bosley, 6 mana means Krasis. It's that 4/4 flyer, gains 2, draws. And we'll see Vraska's Contempt again from Kane, taking care of the flyer, but the damage is still done. There's still the 2 cards in Ian's hand.
Well, they did both gain 2 life, so that's basically equal.
So that's a wash. Fortunately, Vraska's Contempt exiles the Krasis. Do you see that Memorial to Folly in play? Okay, search for Azcanta.
The game's been going on for a while, so this search for Azcanta is exactly what Kane is looking for to just get back into this game. He's at a fairly comfortable life total to just kind of take a turn off and find exactly what he needs when this transforms basically the turn after he cast it.
Yeah, Bosley committing hand here. Wild Growth Walker on the battlefield, now Merfolk Branchwalker. Explores into another Wild Growth Walker.
That's just a good combination.
A lot of pressure then on Kane to find a sweeper. Now he does have a scry off the search, and he'll get to tap it on the right away. So,
is it a scry?
I guess it's a surveil.
Exactly.
It's a surveil.
It's much more of a. It's not quite a surveil. Not enough of a surveil to work with disinformation campaign. But
that would be nice.
We all know what's going on here.
If Search for Azcanta just for free picked up your campaign every turn.
Ugh. You know what?
that is my. I like that kind of magic.
I'll hold off on transforming it.
Yeah. I like what we have going on here. That's fine. We'll just keep picking it up.
All right,
that is the Kaya's Wrath. I think we have it. Board is clear. Azcanta is transformed. It's a big turn. Kane's tapped out here.
Oh.
Incubation Druid. Not the follow-up Ian was looking for.
Well, we do see a Memorial to Folly hanging out down there, so if Bosley can just say, get a card that he wants into his graveyard, that's worth another spell. Unfortunately, the Vraska's Contempt did exile that Hydroid Krasis earlier.
Right. That's the card he'd like to have, especially now that he's adapted the Incubation Druid. He has a ton of mana to work with.
So much mana.
Now, let's see what we have. Llanowar Elves, Wild Growth Walker, Merfolk Branchwalker.
There is a Biogenic Ooze hiding out there.
Okay, you're right. There is the Biogenic Ooze that was hit by an Absorb early on in the game.
That card's a real threat.
And we're going to see the Ooze, except it's going to be absorbed for the second time.
Same as it ever was.
So let's look at this one. For a 5-mana 2/2, when it enters the battlefield, it gets a second 2/2. At the beginning of his end step, all his oozes grow. And for 4 mana, he can make another ooze.
You think that's pretty good when you have a ton of mana?
That seems like it'll be okay.
Oh, yeah. It's 6 power and toughness. And then the next turn, it's like 16 power and toughness.
This is actually an interesting one. In Ian's deck, he's gone for cards like one of Biogenic Ooze. A lot of times we're seeing Growth Chamber Guardian in this kind of slot. However, he's going for a bit of a heavier punch with this one.
Right, and this is likely a result, or a response rather, to a lot of people who are just playing things like, say, Ravenous Chupacabra, where you want something with a more immediate payoff than something that forces you to commit your next turn into getting that payoff.
As Kane keeping pace, he's hoping to get the point where he can tap this Azcanta. There was an attack with Incubation Druid, but that was mortified. And wow, Bosley actually, he sees that he has no more plays. He sees that Azcanta. You a lot of times see players like to play 4 more turns of that, but I like what Bosley's doing here.
Bosley's a very strong player, right? He actually has a pretty good history. He's Baltimore local, couple GP top 8s under his belt. Very, very strong, and this is actually an example where it looks like a sign of weakness to just pack up the cards, but choosing the spot to do it in a matchup that's going to drag out, this is strong, and I have a lot of respect for this.
Win for Kane Rianhard. You mentioned Bosley, a Maryland local. See there with MTG First local store here. I believe that was the Friday BCW challenge taking place there before the event as well.
Yeah, their shop's great. They have a ton of stuff there.
So going to the sideboard, now I do want to mention here, we saw those 2 teams at 10-1. They have already played each other this tournament, which means that this is actually a pair down. We see the records there, 10-1 and 9-2.
Right. At this point, this is the situation where You know, this extra win is going to mean a lot for both of them, but the stakes almost feel higher for the 9-2 because their losses are so much heavier than the losses at 10-1. At 10-1, you go, I got another couple of shots to punch my ticket into the top 8. At 9-2, you really just don't have as much wiggle room.
So the Star City Games, you want to get some of the latest news here, especially a breakdown of this weekend's event. Make sure you're subscribed to the newsletter over at Star City Games. We have highlights from our best articles of the week. You can find out when the next SCG Tour date is and find invitational qualifiers and game nights. You can sign up for free, starcitygames.com/newsletter. If you're following us, watching us over on our main page, that's just up in the right corner of your screen.
Yeah, the newsletter's fantastic. It's just like getting extra articles and free content straight to your inbox.
So I do want to look at our sideboards here. Thief of Sanity has been the standout card in the Esper Control sideboard. Am I being too extreme when I say I think I've seen them boarded in every match?
Right, that's what we've been seeing, but the biggest reason for that is we haven't seen Esper Control play against one of the red decks or the white aggressive
right,
decks.
You probably don't want it there.
Where it's a little embarrassing. But in these grindy matchups, what you're trying to do is basically just stretch them on what they need to be answering.
Okay.
Normally it's pretty easy whenever you're just playing a wall of spells and, say, only a Chromium and no other creatures. It's pretty easy for these decks to just board out all their creature removal and not have to respect them at all. But an early copy of Thief of Insanity can just punk someone out of the game. And if you're expecting this card to come down early from Bosley's side of the table, you have to have enough cards in your deck to check that, which is going to dilute your overall deck to be weaker to what the Esper deck is ultimately doing. So if you have to have, say, 8 removal spells to consistently draw them against this Thief of Sanity, but they only have 4 Thief of Sanities, and they have more card selection, you're going to end up on the bad side of that more often than not.
Yeah, it's this thing where you just don't want to let your opponent sideboard, right? When you play these do-nothing control decks, your opponent says, all right, I have all these negates, all these duresses, these cards are insane against you, and they're saying, wait, hold on. You can't do that. You can't get away with that. I'm going to board in these Thief of Sanities.
Exactly, and that's something that we saw yesterday. We saw one of our Sultai mid-range players just ended up not boarding in their negates because they felt like they needed to be proactive and they could only bring in so many answers. But negate is how they end up beating these Teferis.
Well, especially you look at the spot removal Ian plays. Cards like Assassin's Trophy. If I'm in an Esper Control deck, yes, please Assassin's Trophy my creature. I would love the extra land.
Oh, you mean 3-mana Rampant Growth, my opponent discards a card?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, I'll probably play that.
Okay, sure. We see these decks a lot of times playing Growth Spiral in their control decks just to kind of get ahead on mana, get their planeswalkers out faster. That's a better version of that card.
Yeah, it's like how many times, you have to think how many times is your opponent going to tap that extra land. And against a mono white opponent, sure, give them a plains. But here, if you give Esper Control that extra land, they will use it every turn for the game.
Exactly. And we saw Kane have to shock for a couple of his lands that last game, and that's worth 2 points. So there's even a spot where it could be a life gain spell.
Mulligan here for Ian Bosley. On his sideboard, he actually can continue to go big here as well. So only 2 duress, 2 negate. That's less than we've seen out of most players. But he does have 2... It looks like all his Carnage Tyrants are being played out of the sideboard today.
That's fantastic. So the big thing that Carnage Tyrants are really bad in is against these aggressive decks. And this is just showing a clear hedge to respect that the white deck is likely going to show up as it's a natural foil to the Carnage Tyrants that people would likely be bringing to try and crush these Sultai mirrors. And on top of that, if people are starting to play things like Kaya's Wrath, Carnage Tyrant looks a little bit worse in your main deck anyway.
Yeah.
So if you're not as good at paving the way for it with your main deck discard spells to pick out these Kaya's Wraths anyway, you don't want a card that's a liability against the aggro decks and not as good as it used to be against the control decks.
On 6, Ian has kept, starts with Memorial to Folly. Speaking of some crushing things he can do out of his sideboard, he has 2 Crushing Canopy, gives him an answer to Thief of Sanity, while also being able to play against Search for Azcanta.
Yes, that is one of the big breakout sideboard cards that we've been seeing a lot of in the last couple of weeks. That wasn't a huge player before it, but it's been quite impressive.
Thought Erasure from turn 2 from Kane. Take a look at the hand. Bosley has that Biogenic Ooze again. Looks like he has land 3. Vivian Reed, Merfolk Branchwalker, and the Eldest Reborn.
Memorial to Folly, Woodland Cemetery.
Yeah.
That's a kitchen finks if I ever saw one.
Those cards like Woodland Cemetery, they are great dual lands, except when they're terrible.
Yeah, normally when you have one of those on turn 2, you're, yes!
Yeah.
But this is when you're paying the price for having Memorial over a swamp.
And how do you feel about this play from Kane? Rather than going from any of the heavy hitting cards, he's just going to go ahead and chip down by taking the Merfolk Branchwalker, hoping to keep Ian off enough lands to cast anything.
So it's not necessarily that he never wants Ian to be able to cast those. It's just about buying time, and Merfolk Branchwalker is either going to draw a land or dig Ian closer to a land, which unlocks the other cards in his hand. So this is sort of virtual card advantage.
And this really paid off. Takes the main phase to Mortify Incubation Druid. He wants no mana. Here's Jadelight Ranger. Does it resolve? Is Kane willing to absorb it? And he is. No land, no land. Yeah.
That's fine. We take that for 3.
5th land, are we seeing the Hero of Dominaria? And this could be a runaway. Teferi on the board. Plus is up to 5. Untaps 2. He just needed to keep Ian off balance long enough to make this happen.
This is going to put the game out of reach.
Yeah, and Ian picks up the cards, shakes the hand. So Kane Rianhard gets the first match win here on the standard table, 2-0. Now he needs to look for Lancaster or Whitehouse to help him out.
Yeah, that was a match that the first game was basically what we tend to how we expect this to play out. We see the Sultai deck get to do some impressive things where it does get to, some of its cards are inevitably going to resolve, but Esper is just better at drawing a bunch of cards and its answers are more versatile. So you get to these points where, I brought it up before, you answer something and then you draw extra cards, or you just